Hello, everybody. Welcome to Radiator Comics Studio. My name is Neil Bredell. My pronouns are he, him. I run Radiator Comics, which distributes self-published and small press comics, graphic novels, and zines. Tonight, we're celebrating the release of Spiny Orb Weaver issue 2, which is our South Florida comic arts journal. Tonight's program is made possible with support from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, and Spiny Orb Weaver is funded by the Ellies, Miami's Visual Arts Award, presented by Oolite Arts. So I want to give a special thanks to the Knight Foundation and to Oolite for their support. We are broadcasting this evening from Miccosukee land. The people from whom this land was stolen are still here and are still caring for this place. It's also important to acknowledge the history of African-American, Bahamian, Haitian, and other Caribbean people whose labor made South Florida what it is today. We all have a responsibility to be better neighbors to the people and places where we're located and to work to dismantle white supremacy. Expressing one's ideas and feelings through comics and zines can be really powerful. And one of our hopes with programming like tonight's is to make those tools of expression more accessible. So thank you for being here with us tonight. Each issue of Spiny Orb Weaver features a new comic by a local cartoonist and an interview with them. And we invite, for the back pages of each issue, former South Florida residents to reflect on their time here. The featured cartoonist for issue 2 is Miami's Drew Lerman, who provides us with a 12-page story featuring characters from his comic strip Snake Creek. The back pages of this issue include a new comic by Chris López and an essay by comics critic Rob Clough, each of whom grew up here in Miami. And so we're excited to have all three contributors, Drew, Chris, and Rob, here with us tonight. And in a minute, Chris and Drew are going to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their comics. But I wanted to introduce Rob first, who will be moderating the event. In addition to writing comics reviews for the Comics Journal, Soul Rad, and his own website, High Low, Rob Clough is the programming coordinator for SPX, the Small Press Expo in Bethesda, Maryland, which is the nation's largest small press comics festival, and dear to the hearts of many of us in the room tonight. Rob is a full-time writer living in Durham, North Carolina. So welcome, Rob. I'll hand the event over to you and ask you maybe to talk a minute or two about your essay if you'd like. And I'll be back at the end to help out with the Q&A.
Thank you, Neil. So I was excited to first hear about Spiny Orb Weaver and Neil's efforts in general with regard to Radiator Comics in South Florida, and even more excited to be asked to contribute something to the comic. I'm not a cartoonist or a creative writer. I do critical essays. But one thing I think about as much as I do comics is Miami. Although a place that I haven't lived in for 34 years now, but I still consider to be my home. I am the rare creature, and actually, like all three of us, I believe, born and raised in that city, a city that is, by its nature, extremely transitory. And it's extremely transitory and brings lots of people from lots of different places looking for a new start frequently. And in growing up there, one of the things I thought about was how many different Miamis there are to a number of different people. And those different Miamis can vary based on your age and when you grew up there, and certainly race and ethnicity, and issues related to both are part of the fabric of the city in terms of creating its culture, but also exploiting and marginalizing those peoples throughout the years. So one of the things I want to talk about this night is kind of that idea of what Miami is, what Miami-ness is, what is the essence of the city, and does it even have one, or is it possible to have one given how many different kinds of experiences there are? And one of the things I talk about in my essay is I'm a little bit older than Chris and Drew, and I grew up in Kendall, a suburb of Miami. Although rightfully can be said, most of Miami is a suburb of Miami. The fact it doesn't really have a heart in the way that other big cities do is kind of part of its essence. And going outside my street, facing east, bustling street, North Kendall Drive, Dayland's down there. Facing west, you go past 107th Avenue, and there's nothing but strawberry fields, tomato fields for miles and miles and miles. And that was my experience as a child. I remember driving out there, and then suddenly all that was there. And then as I grew, the expansion west into what was essentially once swampland was very interesting to me, as were various different like ages of the city, where like major events kind of shook who lived there. And that was something I wanted to get at in the essay. But the major thing in talking about Miami is that this sort of lack of cohesiveness as a city led in part to the difficulty of any kind of cohesive art scene. And not only that, but like how difficult it was to like even start interest in it. Miami is lacks the infrastructure and industry that other big cities have in supporting the arts, because there are industries there like publishing in New York, music in New York, plays in New York, movies in LA, et cetera, et cetera. And even other cities in the country like Portland, Chicago, all had certain built-in advantages to creating thriving art scenes. Chris Ware once said that Chicago is such a thriving comic scene because it's so cold for so much of the time. People just want to stay inside and do stuff. In Miami, you have the opposite problem. You have not only nice weather most of the year, the culture is one that it's Miami has like a jock culture, as an outside culture. And there have been periodic attempts to create scenes, and they happen over time, and some of them even flourish for short periods of time until the old story of gentrification moves in. Like Coconut Grove used to be a queer bohemian community, and over a certain period of time, that it was turned into like, you know, a giant mall, more or less. So finding ways to like find comics, to get at comics, and how difficult that was, that there weren't a lot of central walking areas in Miami, unlike big cities. I talk about in my essay like having to take a bus for 45 minutes to get to A&M Comics. And it was totally worth it for me at the time, but it's hard to thrive in that kind of setting where everything is so spread out and sprawling, and it's a car culture. So we'll be talking more about that Miami-ness as we continue in the hour. But in essence, in order to create art in Miami, as I said in the title of my essay, it's an act of will. It's not something that's just going to happen. Some people have to make it happen. And that's why it's so gratifying for me to see what the things that Neil is doing. And to see the scene that's really popping up there now is very inspiring. So I'll turn it back over to Neil.
Thank you. So I think what is going to happen now is Chris and then Drew are going to talk about their comics, and then followed by a conversation. So I'm going to share my screen, and Chris, if you want to take it away.
Sure. So I'll give a brief intro to who I am. I'm just a guy who's been reading comics since the early 80s and started making comics late 90s, early 2000s, kind of when there's like an explosion of web comics out there. So I started doing a web comic for myself for a while called Deados. I was like a fantasy comic, but it was really just like an excuse for me to draw more. I kind of intentionally went into it knowing that the writing was kind of be basic, but as long as it forced me to draw, I was happy with it. And through that, I met a bunch of other people doing webcomics at the time. We all met up at San Diego Comic-Con 2003, and just comics and community kind of really set in at that point. And eventually the popularity of webcomics like went down for a little bit. And about that time, I stopped making comics, wound up moving to Chicago, and got involved with Cake. Neil actually sent me an email telling me when I could come in and help set up chairs and tables for the first Cake event that I volunteered at. And that, seeing that community, seeing all these creators and comics definitely lit that fire in me again. So I started getting inspired by other art, music, whatever. I've done a couple of comics adapting my friend Randy's dramatic pieces, first a monologue because it was short, but also a full play, and getting an entire graphic novel done. And so when I was asked to be a part of a Spiny Orb Weaver, naturally I jumped at the chance, since Miami has been such a big part of my life. And so the comic that I did for it, Beach Day, there it is about my memories of going to the beach with my mom and my siblings way back when. I was never the most outdoorsy kid, surprise, surprise. Being dragged along to a sandy, burning hot beach wasn't high on my priorities. So it struck me as funny when I really felt nostalgic for it. And so for the comic, I wanted to capture my adolescent perspective on the trips themselves, but also make sure I was underscoring it with how I currently feel about just remembering that time with my family, and just those special moments that they created. And then coming up with the ideas, there were like a ton of them that didn't make it in. Like, for example, my mom loved the beach so much that even on vacation, we went to other beaches like Sanibel or Marco Island, or like feeling that specific scratchy seaweed from Miami Beach that just feels like plastic and it's just horrible. But all in all, I've been pleased to hear the reactions from people who've read it, especially those that grew up in Florida, and telling them how much it just opened up the floodgate of memories. And yeah, hopefully you all can experience that as well.
Cool. Thanks so much, Chris. And now, oops, we'll hand it over to Drew.
Thanks, Neil. My name is Drew. I do the comic strip Snake Creek, which I, for the most part, publish on Instagram. This is the cover of the first collection of Snake Creek strips. So a little bit about Snake Creek. It was a strip that I started in the beginning of, or I guess June of 2018 was when the first strip started. And it was kind of an attempt to just have fun as an artist. Like, I felt like I'd had a lot of very ambitious projects that were, I don't know, sucking a little bit of the fun that I was hoping to get out of the artistic process. So for Snake Creek, I just thought, let me just be loose and do something that I will enjoy. A lot of this stuff I talked to Neil about at greater length in the interview contained within this issue of Spiny Orb Weaver. But yeah, basically, for like, I think probably for the strip that's kind of on the screen and for the first several months of doing Snake Creek, my rule was that I only gave myself 5 minutes per panel. And so that way in 20 minutes, I would have a complete comic strip. And that was, really revolutionary for me. At the time I started Snake Creek, I had my daughter was not even 1 year old and I didn't have a ton of time. And I thought, well, I can find 20 minutes to do a strip. And thus Snake Creek was born. I thought it ended up being a really good way to kind of feel out the universe of the strip by not overthinking it. Within a few months, I think I did start allowing myself a little more time for each strip and stopped doing it every single day. And, it kind of took on its own life. But yeah, after that first year, I collected, a volume of the, I guess, June 2018 through June 2019 of the strip. After that, I began, so this is the cover of Detective Double Digest. So in the fall of 2019, I decided, because I don't know, I thought it would be a good idea. I guess it remains to be seen if it was, that I would do the next Snake Creek book will be one long arc, like a graphic novel in comic strip form. So I had one of these many big top-down ideas. I was like, okay, I'll just funnel that into Snake Creek and maybe it'll take me a year. So it's been like a year and a half. It'll certainly be like 2 before it's totally done. But anyway, so I've been working on this really long Snake Creek storyline in comic strips that I've been posting on Instagram since the fall of 2019. But luckily, in the midst of that, I had a few opportunities to do standalone stories using these Snake Creek characters. So one of them was the Detective Double Digest that's on the screen. The cartoonist Pete Fakey invited me to contribute a 12-page story to his Double Digest series. So the first one he did was called Wacky Western with the artist A.T. Pratt, which was 2 Western stories, one by Pete and one by A.T. Pratt. And then the second issue was the Detective Double Digest, which Pete and I did, each doing a detective story. I was racking my brain for how to do it for a while, and then I realized I could just use the Snake Creek characters and turn them into the detectives. So that was kind of exciting moment, realizing I could just use these characters for like any project that came my way. I also used them for a 2-page story in an anthology that Neil and Jamila Rouser put out called Sun and Sand Anthology. So, that was great. This is Shtick, which just came out this month. This includes some watercolor comic strips that are don't have the Dav and Roy characters from Snake Creek. I still kind of think of it as taking place in the Snake Creek universe, and I have my thoughts about how I might kind of merge these worlds. But anyway, this kind of leans into a more dialogue-driven, I think, approach to comics. That was a little bit of a different change of pace for me. Really, it was just a way of me trying to learn how to use watercolors, and that kind of turned into this little book called Shtick. And then in addition to that, there's the 12-page story that Neil was kind enough to invite me to do for Spiny Orb Weaver called Head Trip. Also, just like with the Snake Creek characters, I had a lot of fun doing this. It was very different experience because, Neil was, very involved as an editor. And it was the first time that I'd had an opportunity to work with an editor. And, Neil proved to be a very thoughtful and sensitive and just excellent editor who really improved the, final product that that we ended up with in this book. So I'm, a lot of what Neil and I spoke about in the interview and a lot of what I thought about, what I think about doing Snake Creek is sort of oriented around improvisation. But I would say this is kind of the least improvised in some ways strip or story that I've done with Snake Creek. I didn't plan it all out in advance, but I did pencil the panels before, or pencil the pages, each page, like before drawing it, just to make sure the composition kind of was working and that I wasn't like drawing myself into a corner. So, yeah, I'm excited about this story, and I'm, obviously it just came out last week, and interested to see what folks will think of it. yeah, I think that's a pretty good, super fast overview of where I'm at as an artist right now. And Neil, I guess I'm glad that we didn't go all the way to the end of the story to keep the, yeah, exactly. That's me.
All right. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Chris. So I wanted to open up our conversation by talking about what does Miami mean to you as a person living there? For Drew, a person who grew up there and lives there now, and for Chris, this is 15 years in your rearview mirror now. And what, if anything, do you consider to be essential elements of what Miami is? And Drew, why don't you start?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I could probably think of many things that it means for me. Centrally, it's just the place where my extended family lives and where my wife's family also lives. The reason why I ended up moving back to Miami in 2013 was that my wife and I were living, I was in Boston and she was in New York, and we had met, and we were both from South Florida, and she was from Fort Lauderdale and I was from North Miami. And, we ended up moving back here when, I don't know, it looked like we might be wanting to start a family together and stuff. And so, Miami meant family to me. And it's also, I think, a pretty family oriented place, frankly. And I think that might have to do with the extent that it's an immigrant community throughout Miami, and, the importance of those strong family bonds. My dad's family is Cuban. He was born in Venezuela because he was born after the revolution. But they just lived in Venezuela briefly after, they went there in 1959 or 60 or 61. I don't know exactly what year they moved, probably 60 or 61. But anyway, so family is definitely a big part of it, with everything that anybody has a family knows about the ups and downs of family life. I also think of Miami as, sort of like the future ground zero for climate change, so living here, there could be times where I don't think about it as much, but, just seems like it's coming for us. And it's a big, I don't know, it's a big thing about what living in Miami means to me, and that I think that I associate it with a lot. And also just being sort of, I remember being in high school and watching like high school movies where there was like the captain of the football team, and, like this whole like Americana sensibility that I found to be like so foreign from anything related to my own experience. Like, it was just very, I don't know, I felt like, I was in a huge public school. My high school was like 3,800 students. Everything was very fragmented. Everybody had small groups that they interacted with. For the most part, it was fairly segregated, despite being an extremely diverse existence. I would say that different, races and socioeconomic groups and whatever, whatever way you want to break it up, kind of, there was a sort of a segregation among all of that. So, it was a diverse place, but also I felt like it was kind of a place where there was a lot of like separation. People lived in their own enclaves. I grew up in a pretty Jewish area. Like all my best friends growing up were Jewish, I mean, there was, a few exceptions, but that was pretty much like the world that I grew up in. And so like Jewishness wasn't like the thing that made me unique from my friends. It was just sort of like the air that I breathed. Like in 7th grade, every single weekend was like a bar or bat mitzvah. So, sometimes you had to pick which one you were going to go to. So, I don't know. I could go on and on. I guess the last thing I would say is just Miami is a place that has always been hard for me to like wrap my mind around and understand, despite the fact that I've lived here for the vast majority of my life. I always just feel like whenever I'm in an area of Miami other than my neighborhood, I'm like, oh, this is so exciting. I hope I'll understand it one day. It's just it always feels mysterious to me.
We'll return to that in a moment, but Chris, you go ahead.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the sort of Jewish experience. Growing up, like there was one Jewish kid in my school, but that's because it was a Catholic school. So his parents wanted that good education, I guess. But yeah, Miami is still where all my family is at. My mom, dad, my 3 siblings. So I try and visit every year, and I'm hopefully not too out of touch, but it's definitely not the same place that I left 15 years ago. I'm glad to see that like Wynwood and the arts community has definitely been growing. That was always something that I felt like I missed, and not having a lot of that in Miami. And so I always envied seeing uh, shows opening in New York or all cool comic stuff happening in Chicago. And I was like, man, Miami's got to have that. All we have is like Lincoln Road and South Beach. So it was always something that that inside of me is just, it's always going to be a part of me, just because there was so much to experience there. And one thing about Miami is it is spread out, especially now more than ever. It's always building. Seems like there's more swamp to develop every day, and it keeps on like going further west. I'm just like, how is this even one city anymore? It's this kind of mess going on. And so being able to sort of like, I think that kind of like underscores the segregation that you see sometimes. It's so hard to get across town. Like, of course there are going to be all these different conclaves of people, and just things are just separate because of physical limitations. But that being said, it's also the place that like is the spot for immigration from Central and South America. And so I grew up as a Latino with Mexican Nicaraguan dad and a Cuban mom. So I'm very familiar with that immigrant experience. And you think of Miami, and like the first thing you're going to think of probably is Cuban immigrants there. But like over the years, it's really become a rich culture with lots of Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Colombians, and it's that sort of mix of all these different cultures is what makes Miami unique, and probably a similar experience to you. Once I left the city and I realized what normal was for other people and how different my experience was growing up in that mix, yeah, it was definitely eye-opening, and made me appreciate the city a lot more.
When you leave any place like that, the things that are headaches, like for example, traffic, which is unbelievably terrible, or being there in August, that kind of fades into memory. And these other things, the weirder memories, the sense of in a city like Chicago, for example, when it's winter, it people brave the weather, but it's still a time that's not like people are out and about and around and doing things. And that is never, ever the case in Miami. People are always out and about around doing things, except maybe in 2 weeks in January, and that's it. And so that level of buzz is kind of interesting. And as you mentioned, for a person like me who was I had health problems as a child, so I didn't get to like play outside a lot, and so I was naturally bookish and introverted. It's like this culture was so it was weird to me. It was like something I didn't relate to, and yet it was all I knew. and I also don't understand. I also understand the immigrant experience. My father was American, but my mother was from Chile and came here in the 1950s. Like a lot of people from Latin America did at the time, as Miami was really opening up post World War II. That was like one of its big booms, especially as a tourist town, and especially as a place where knowing Spanish was a huge plus. It started to become a huge plus, as opposed to like simply another part of the landscape as it is now. And relating to that experience, Chris, I want to talk about your piece. I felt that so hard when I read your piece. And I grew up in Kendall, which is like a good, 2 hours away from the beach, something like that, hour and a half. And we didn't usually go north to Miami Beach because of where we lived. From where you live in Westchester, it made sense just to go a little further north to Miami Beach. We went south to Matheson Hammock, Cape Florida, places like that. And yeah, as a kid, I was sort of like, I never understood the point of the activity. And there's one particular panel where you talk about when you get to the beach and you take off your shoes, there's this patch of just blazing hot white sand that you have to like run across as quickly as possible, like running across hot coals to get to like, the wet sand. And I had a visceral memory of that when I read that panel. And then when you're there, sand infiltrating like every part of your body. And yeah, those long, uncomfortable rides home, because it's like 2 hours home and like you're in this wetsuit and you're still kind of covered with sand, no matter how much you shower off. And I went and of course you're going in July, and there's like a mild amount of relief from like the breezes from the ocean, but not much. And all in all, I was just like, wow, this is really, why are we doing this? This is very unpleasant. And yet they stand out as these visceral memories. And when I was older, I found other ways to kind of claim the beach. Like I started going at night with my friends, which is awesome because it's cool. It's fun to look at the beach at night, and it's not a lot of people there. The other thing I hated about the beach is that it was crowded, and I didn't like that. I thought your piece in particular really stood out because looking at the evolution of your line in these strips is very interesting. Like in your earlier color strips, it really seems like you're leaning hard on that color to as a storytelling thing. And as your work has developed and your line has gotten much more confident, and in this piece, it's extremely confident and really really appealing. The clear line that you're using, and then the little levels of detail, and just a touch of like cartooniness in the way you drew faces was evocative in its naturalism, but still retain that kind of like, because of the cartoonishness, that like little slightly rubbery memory haze. Can you, I'd like to hear more about like your process in drawing and what consciously you were trying to do in that piece, while to what goals you were looking for visually, and and if you thought you were able to achieve them.
Sure. So yeah, going into this project, I knew it was going to be 4 pages. I knew it was going to be black and white. And so I made some decisions at that point, and wanted to have a style for my characters that was going to be realistic to a certain point, and that is probably just a personal aesthetic, just because I love drawing people, and that's what I draw the most of. But I kind of took the idea that I think I read from Scott McCloud a long time ago about masking and making sure that my characters aren't too realistic in the face, especially so that more people could relate to them. And I think abstracting that away to a certain point, stops it from being me or my brother and becomes, your brother or something like that. I did really want to sort of make sure that I didn't mess up drawing my mom, because that was going to be important to me, and I wanted to make sure that panels that had her in it did her justice. I think I got most of the way there, but probably could be a little bit better. And I approached this like I do a lot of my other comics projects, where I'll rough it out on paper and pencil pretty quickly, just to make sure that I can get the composition looking like I want, and getting the words in there, making sure that the words fit like I want them to. Actually, so yeah, even before this, I typed up a lot of it just script-wise, and I don't normally do that with a lot of my comics, just because I knew that the space was really limited, and I wanted to make sure that I gave myself enough time to explore the memories that I had of going to the beach and all the different things. Like in my intro, I kind of talked about some of the stuff that I left out, just because they were just, once I started tapping into that, they just started coming, right? And I was just like, okay, now I need to edit myself and make sure that I can pick out the things that make the most sense and tell a good story. So I wound up writing out a bunch of it in a notepad file, and then I sketch it out on pencil and paper, take a picture of it on my phone, and lately I've been using Procreate on my iPad. So then I just transfer that there. And this entire comic was done on Procreate. And I was having fun with all of the zip tone shading, and making sure that I didn't keep that flat, and tried to layer that and rub it out some and make sure that it had some variation in there. So I didn't have a lot of like scratchy shading, and it was more of those tones. And I thought the dots in that were going to be really, really reminiscent of sand. So I think that to me was important as well. And I think it was mostly successful.
It's remarkable how much of that you're able to get using digital tools. Because when I looked at it, I mean, it looked very clear and polished, but it didn't have, I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that it had been done in that way. It looked like it was straight from someone's hand.
It was from my hand.
Well, yes, but I mean, from in the traditional tools rather, and traditional mark making, which is a different kind of like physical experience, is one that Barry would talk about. But at the same time, you really had a sense of like how to create something that like looked like that, that didn't have it wasn't slick in a way that some digitally drawn comics can be.
Sure.
It's like you said, you put the grit in, literally.
Yeah, just stayed away from gradients and airbrush, and Neil definitely helped me out a bit, and he was like, "You're using a font that'll never fly in my book, Chris," and he cracked a whip and made sure that I hand lettered everything. No, he actually asked me really nicely if I thought that would be a good idea, and I was like, you know what, you're right. It's a lot more work, but it's worth it. And so that I think added a lot to the quality of the pages.
Lettering is part of art, and a bad font can take you out of the page real quick.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that added a lot to that level of like that naturalism that you were going for.
Yeah.
Drew, so your interview was so fascinating in reading like your history as an artist, because you're like the exception that proves the rule, in the sense that like you're growing up and like you aggressively pursued all these art contests and grants and things like that, and writing in like different kinds, you cartooning, novels, all sorts of different things. And he talked about how eventually you got frustrated with writing novels and screenplays and other things, and just like cartooning was fun. And you make a point about, as you said in your process, like 5 minutes or less. And I know that was by necessity, obviously, but it seemed clear that after years of this kind of labored approach to art, your ability to free yourself up and not do anything precious and forcing yourself to be as spontaneous as possible really unlocked something for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of funny that like making it easier on yourself can also have the effect of making your work more fun to read, or just have something there, because kind of think, well, if I work really, really, really hard, then it'll definitely be good, because I'll have put in my hours and eaten my vegetables, and everyone will have to see that I've done a good job. But that's clearly not always the case. I think an extreme example is in cartoonists like Liana Fink. If you guys are familiar with her work, she does a lot of stuff for the New Yorker, and mostly just on Instagram. She publishes tons of really scribbly little doodle comics that connect with seemingly everybody on the planet. And I don't know, I like her work a lot. So she comes to my mind as an example of somebody who's work. If you have a very craft oriented person who who reveres a very painstaking approach, that could seem like a real turnoff. But to me, there's just a lot of potential life in work like that. On the other hand, like I do try to improve my craft in some ways, and I like some aspects of drawing that are sort of slow, like cross hatching, for example. So there's a balance, but yeah, definitely you're right to say that something was unlocked when I decided to take a more spontaneous approach, for sure.
The other thing I thought was interesting was, you'd been out of comics for a long time, and then you were like thinking about cartooning again. It was like, all right, well, what's out there? And you found this kind of overwhelming universe that was seemingly hidden from much of the world. And it's fascinating to see some of the names you list and like see some of that in your work. And I thought that all the names you listed, the two I really thought were most there, not necessarily in terms of copying the work, but in terms of like-mindedness, were Matthew Thurber and Mark Bell. And in thinking about this, reading your strip and reading it in the context of the rest of the issue was interesting to me, because when you read if you read your strip and you didn't read the interview, and then you read Chris's strip and then you read my strip, the initial relationship between the three is unclear. And then when I read your interview and you're talking about like not quite having a grip on Miami as a place or a concept, but wanting to incorporate like the weirdness of it into your comics. And that approach reminded me a little bit of like what George Harriman did in Crazy Cat, and the way he incorporated images of the American Southwest into his comics on a regular basis. And the thing that was interesting about that at the time is that you have to remember, like in that time, that was largely like a completely unexplored area of the United States. There weren't like all these ready images of what it looked like down there. It wasn't easy to get there. And in fact, in Gasoline Alley, they have this cross-country trip where like they go down the American Southwest, and it's this ordeal because there's like not a lot of developed roads. And it's worth it because the views are so strange and beautiful and inspiring. Similarly, if you've never been to South Florida, no matter where you are, and I mentioned this before, you know, Miami is one good storm away from like this being swamp again. And the reality of that is that it's kind of swamp now. That whatever efforts have been made, especially anywhere suburban, the flora and fauna in South Florida is kind of overwhelming. And if you've never been there, if something gets overgrown, it gets overgrown quick. It's like that. There's like this constant battle against what's there. You know, growing up in my backyard and just like catching lizards is like a regular thing. Those beloved little creatures, and birds I've never seen elsewhere. It's a weird place. You know, Miami has these canals that crisscross it throughout it, all the suburban areas. And growing up, we were told never play near the canals. And the reason is because there could be alligators there. And it sounds like the sort of thing your parents would say to you to scare you, except it's 100% true. Like I said, it's a weird place. And your strip, as you talk about it, it captures like the sense of no matter what Miami pretends to be in terms of like image, glitz, there's always this nurture, this weird inherent weirdness that lurks. And I think your strip captures that perfectly. And the Mark Bell elements, the kind of absurdity and these kind of like, you know, strange little characters. And then Matthew Thurber, who brings about this kind of absurd dream logic to things. Like your strips, once you adjust to like the visual style, are extremely easy to follow. You know, you adjust to like the use of language and image, and once you immerse yourself in that world, it's just like you're off to the races. And one thing that I thought that was very interesting in terms of like the imagery and the use of language was you said that it was something related to you felt there was something very Jewish about it, like in regard to culture. I want to ask you a question. Are you familiar with the cartoonist Milt Gross?
Yes, I'm a big fan of Milt Gross's. Yeah.
Yeah, because I wanted to show. We saw some of Drew's drawings, and I wanted to put up this drawing of a random Milt Gross comic, and a lot of the same elements are there. It's a little more worked, you see it in this rain, but like you have these little tiny figures contrasted against larger figures. And one thing that Gross was especially known for was kind of creating this what can best be described as this merger of English and Yiddish. And in so doing, Gross conjures up this world, not unlike Drew, in which you have to kind of commit to being in this world. And the more of it, the more time you spend in it, the more you understand it, and like it becomes a natural thing. And that's exactly the experience I had with that. How much of Gross's work do you think directly, like, and consciously informed your own?
It's a great question. I mean, Milt Gross is not someone I've known about for, since I was a kid. I mean, maybe in the last 4 years or so, maybe around the time I was starting Snake Creek, I became aware of Milt Gross. I mean, Paul Toomey put out his book Screwball a couple of years ago, which focused on Milt Gross. So that was like my first real deep dive, or not even deep dive, but my first real big taste of Milt Gross. After that, Sunday Press put out a book called Gross Exaggerations, which is this huge, gorgeous, collection of Milt Gross's work, which I pre-ordered, and my wife bought it for me for my birthday, I guess last year, I think, when it came out. I also have a little book about Gross called Is This a System? Yeah. And anyway, so in the last few years, I've learned a lot about Milt Gross and his work. And so I couldn't call it a formative influence the way something like Mel Brooks for sure was, or the way that Seinfeld was, or plenty of other Jewish comedians, Jackie Mason, Rodney Dangerfield, I could rattle off a lot. But I've definitely thought about Gross in particular lately while using Jewish and Yiddish dialect in certain ways for some of my characters. For this new collection shtick that I just put out, there's an awful lot of that, that sort of language. Something really interesting I learned about Milt Gross in Is This a System, in that book, was that Gross actually didn't really use very much Yiddish, if any, at all. What he did was stick English words into Yiddish grammar, and also sort of like transliterate the pronunciations of those English words. But he wasn't really putting actual Yiddish in. He was just using that Yiddish grammar and kind of sticking the English words in those slots, so it would be comprehensible to a wide audience, but still kind of like signal Yiddish without having to actually use Yiddish. I don't have a really complex system like that in my own usage or whatever, but that's definitely something I've thought about a lot. I'm sure Milt Gross, although I was going to say I'm sure Milt Gross knew a lot more Yiddish than I do, but I've actually read that I think Milt Gross didn't really grow up in Yiddish-speaking home. I think his family spoke like German and maybe some other language, but not Yiddish. But anyway, Milt Gross is a really interesting figure that I've thought about a lot, and I've also recently gotten into this other contemporary, a few years maybe earlier in terms of his original strips, his name Harry Hirschfield, who did A.B. the Agent.
Yeah.
So he also, his stuff's a little bit less broad farce and a little bit more. I've actually heard that Ben Catchor is a fan of Harry Hirschfield, but not as much of a fan of Milt Gross, which I kind of think makes sense because Milt Gross is so like silly and over the top, and I could see that perhaps rubbing Mr. Catchor the wrong way. I don't know, but
It's kind of a funny thing.
yeah. Anyway, yes, I definitely I like Milt Gross a lot. I haven't really I have a lot more of his work I want to like read and get into. I haven't really read any of the Dave's Delicatessen strips yet. I've read like Nice Baby and Count Screwloose a lot, but I think Dave's Delicatessen was maybe his final strip, and that's one I want to explore more. I mean, it's in the Gross Exaggerations book. I just haven't gotten to it yet.
Have you ever read He Done Her Wrong?
No, I have not. I mean, I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
It was there's a scratchboard comic by a cartoonist named Lynn Ward called God's Man, and it's in the running for one of the like 50 million things considered to be the first graphic novel. It definitely counts, and it's a very serious modernist book a lot of it is about union related issues and social justice issues. And it's a striking work. And Gross, He Done It Wrong is essentially and it's silent, there's no words. This was somewhat unusual at the time. So Gross wrote He Done It Wrong as kind of a parody of this book. And while it's funny and he's making fun of some of the things that Lynn Ward was doing, it's also like it's a pretty sumptuous visual feast where you learn that despite kind of like Milk Gross has this fundamentally like squiggly line. It's squiggly and squirmy, and you can't quite put your eyes around the characters because it seems like they're moving on the page. And this is very different. It's like all about shadow and dramatic effects. So we're nearing the hour. I just kind of wanted to talk one last thing about kind of circling back to Miami. And as I noted, all of our pieces together like sort of comment on each other in a little way. In that I talk about the weirdness of Miami, and your piece and Drew's comic is a kind of a personification of the spirit of the weirdness that is there and has led to periodic attempts at creating art and art communities in like their purest form for the love of the art itself. And then Chris's comic relating to like not only a particular kind of like the experience of immigrant culture. A lot of the experiences shared by immigrants are shared by like everybody in Miami. It's like the beach is there, and it's one of the beautiful things about it is that it may be crowded and it may be annoying. And in Fort Lauderdale, I remember my grandmother lived in a condominium with a private beach. But the beach was accessible if you had transportation. But it also gets like the sense of growing up there, even if you didn't necessarily like all the experiences, it really strikes you later as to like, that was kind of strange. And I'm glad I have these memories. And then my essay sort of talks about both of these things. And one of the things I kind of assert is that in thinking about other cartoonists from South Florida, they may talk about South Florida, but there's like Vanessa Davis and Jared Rossello, among others, who who are a little bit older, and there are more recent cartoonists now, especially artists in Spiny Orb Weaver #1, and the Sun and Sand anthology, both of which are excellent. But there's not a quintessential Miami experience that I associate them with in the way I would associate Ben Catcher with New York or Chris Ware in Chicago. It's like there's something about the essence of those places that they embody in their work. And I'd argue that that's not true of any Miami cartoonist. And I'm not sure it has much to do with the cartoonist. I think it has a lot more to do with Miami not having, it's like, what, in New York City, your 5 boroughs, there's still Manhattan, there's still Midtown, and you think of it as like that's the heart of the city, or one of the hearts of the city, one of the essential areas of the city. Chicago has a lot of places like that too, and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and most of the other metropolitan cities, and even the slightly smaller ones, Portland, Seattle, have like bohemian communities, arts communities, where things center around. I mean, it doesn't really have that either. And I guess the concluding question I would ask is, what do you think about this idea? Is there an essential Miami to capture, and how do you capture it? We'll start with Chris.
Is there an essential Miami? I think that question is actually still to be answered. I think Miami undergoes so much change every 20 years or so, that I think the core itself is very different when you look back at it. I'm trying to see if I can draw a line that like connects sort of the Miami of what I remember to the Miami that I read about, to the Miami that I see when I visit my family. And they're all such different places. There's got to be something there, but I don't know if I found it yet. I don't know. What do you think, Drew?
I think it's such a great question, and something that I have been thinking about even before returning to comics. In addition to where's that comics, like where's the great Miami novel? You could think of a great New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco. You could think of contenders for the great novel in a lot of different metropolitan areas. I don't think there's a really even contenders for that award of the great Miami novel. And move on to comics, certainly not. I love to there's that like potentially toxic ambitiousness somewhere inside of me that wants to do something like that. Figure out like how to create something that you could say like, yeah, this is really captured everything. I mean, one of my very favorite novels is Underworld by Don DeLillo, and it's an 800-page novel, goes all over the country, has amazing scenes in New York and Arizona and Miami and LA and everywhere in the country. So I mean, that's like a great American novel in its execution. And I think that a great Miami novel would have to be a similarly sprawling endeavor that would have to take place in a lot of different neighborhoods, a lot of different groups, a lot of different conflicts, and a lot of different sensibilities coming up against one another. And the question is, how do you, as somebody from one very unique and specific background, speak for all of these voices? And I think there's a lot of problematic questions you're going to run into when trying to do something like that, because no matter how many parts of that puzzle you may have a toe in based on your own birth and background and upbringing, you're still going to be necessarily wanting to speak for a lot of voices that are somewhat outside your ken. And I don't know the artistic and aesthetic choices that you would have to make to try to do that. But I will say, like, for me, writing a book about, a comic, about like the Miami Jewish experience, even the Miami, New York Jewish and Cuban Jewish experience, which are two sides of my own background. My mom's family was from New York and my dad's family was from Cuba. That gives you a variety, but it certainly wouldn't be something that I would say like, yeah, that's what Miami's all about. That's my own experience. So I think you'd have to really do your frickin', I don't know. I don't know how you could do it. But I would love to see it, and I would love to do it, but I just don't know that it's, I don't know that it's something that I or anybody could really do successfully, frankly, if that answers your question.
It does, and it speaks to something you said about the segregated nature of the culture, is that Miami's a lot of diversity, but it's not the so-called melting pot that New York at least tries to claim to be. That there is an awareness of other cultures, but not necessarily tons of interaction. And I think about Black culture in Miami in particular. And when I think about art coming out of Miami, inspired by Miami, I think of the film Moonlight and how beautiful that was. And watching it, it's like, that's a very Miami film, and yet one that was so dramatically different from my own experience. It was astounding. And that's what I'm kind of hoping for in the future, is sort of finding and uplifting those voices, marginalized voices. And in Miami, there are so many that have been marginalized, and Black community, the Haitian community in particular, since the very beginning. Haitians and Haitian culture have been marginalized. And in the queer community, which is fascinating in Miami, because Miami has a huge queer culture, which is, until probably recently, was so dramatically underground, and so less present in the mainstream culture of the city than in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, etc. And I think Miami will never be a cohesive whole, but I'm hoping for at least a quilt, and a quilt with many more and different kinds of experiences than those that we've seen thus far. It's 9:10, so I think on that note, I will conclude, and we'll open up the floor for questions, and I will hand this back to Neil.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Chris and Drew. I think we have time for like a couple of questions. So if anybody has any questions, you can either click on the raise your hand button in the reactions or participants section of your Zoom menu, or you can type it into the chat and ask a question. I actually kind of had a question that sort of piggybacked onto that last conversation, which was like, even if there aren't like a cohesive sort of like Miami style of cartooning, I was wondering if any of you see anything as like common qualities of comics or like the work of cartoonists themselves coming out of South Florida.
I mean, I'm speaking for myself here, but I really didn't see like Miami cartoonists when I was growing up. And so that to me was always like something from somewhere else, right? So like I could never find that. And so I guess that never really ground itself in me. So like that's not something that I guess I look for really. So I haven't really noticed it.
I agree. I don't have a really deep idea of like, oh yeah, here's the stable of Miami cartoonists that I can analyze. But I do think, obviously there's an interest in, sort of a multilingualism that you see in a lot of the work that comes out of Miami, just because that's part of the culture. But I do think that's something I noticed that you probably wouldn't see in comics from too many other cities, is just kind of like a sprinkling of different languages within the work.
Cool. It looks like we have a question from Aramis. Oh, and Aramis writes, Chris, do you think you'll write more comic stories exploring other aspects of your history with Miami?
I hope so. So when Neil asked if I would do something for Spiny Orb Weaver, I came up with 3 pitches, all of which had to do with me growing up in Miami in some way or another. So I've got 2 on deck that hopefully I can get to and flesh out some more. They're probably going to be the next projects I tackle, but it's been a weird year for everybody, and I thought I was going to be more productive in 2021, but hasn't really happened as far as making comics. So I will get to it soon, though.
Cool. Thanks for the question, Aramis. And as somebody who saw the proposals, I can secretly say that they are really fantastic comics, and I'm looking forward to reading them. And it looks like we have a question from Andrew.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, everybody. This has been really great. I just had two questions, one just for Drew and one for Chris and Rob together. But Drew, I guess I was kind of interested in reading your book, your piece, and was thinking about the improvisation, but I was thinking about it, it kind of like rattled my brain, something Rob was talking about with the like language and the drawing. You know, because I think about improv performance, you're a body and you get to talk at the same time. So you like do both, you know, talking and action. But like for a cartoonist, you have to, like, one comes before the other, even if they're interchangeable. So I guess I was curious to hear you talk a little bit about that chicken and egg. Like, does the language come first? Does the drawing come first? How do they change places when they change places? And then for Chris and Rob, there's been lots of great talk about sort of like, this is really fast. I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, which is not Miami, but it's like, I resonate. I'm a transplant here, but like spread out, no cohesiveness. Like, I've only been here 3 years and I can figure that stuff out. So, but your experiences with things like SPX and Cake, I was at SPX a million years ago, or even like a really good comic book shop. Part of it is like talking about building community. And as much as like, there's like, you're wanting to see some cohesiveness, there's also something really great about going into some place like that. That's like the best part is like that it doesn't feel homogenized. That, yeah, there's little groups and pockets, but it's like an event like that, you see all this stuff. So I guess I was curious, when does that come into play? Like, it feels like you need something like that, to like a big tent to bring everybody together, but you also kind of need a scene to fill the tent with. So like, how does that work? I don't know. I mean, maybe that's something to talk about, the history of some of those things like Cake or SPX, and how they kind of, were they a response to a scene? Did they help build the scene? Is probably, again, like sort of hand in hand things. But thank you guys.
So thanks, Andrew, for the question. And I definitely know what you're asking for sure. And I think I can speak a little bit about the nature of improvising with respect to like the drawing versus the writing and how it all interacts. I think generally, when I'm doing a strip, especially one that's not necessarily part of an ongoing storyline, but even if it is, usually what I'll do is, I draw my 4 panels first to begin with. Usually, with the story in Spiny Orb Weaver, it's a 6-panel grid, but with my comic strip, it's a 4-panel grid. And first thing I do is just write out like Snake Creek, Drew Lerman along the top, which kind of buys me some time of like, oh, what am I gonna do? And if I'm really unsure, I'll really do an ornate title. And then usually, I guess I would say I still feel more confident in some ways with my writing than my drawing. So I'll start with my drawing because I know I'll figure out some words that will work. So panel 1, I'm usually going to begin with like, what sounds like it wouldn't suck to draw right now. And usually it's just like, my 2 little characters with like a palm tree behind them, but sometimes I could get a little more ambitious than that. But generally I'm like, okay, let me get my objects in the room here. And then I see where I have some space. And I might want to introduce something like, if I just did 2 people walking yesterday, I might want to put something in today, like a weird bird or something. And so, okay, now I see I have some space left over for text. So what's something that will tickle me a little? And then I'll just kind of throw that in one character's mouth. And then, give somebody else something. And then I might leave myself some space in that panel so that when I go to the second panel and start working there, if there's something I want to add, I can like hop back and put in like a little speech balloon. Like that's something, Rob mentioned Mark Bell's work, and something I love about Mark Bell is that he'll often have a panel that's just like got tons of speech balloons, even from one character. There's just something really funny and interesting about that. So I like leaving space for small speech balloons where you might want them. I noticed that sometimes when I get to the back half of the strip, meaning panel 3 and 4, I kind of am like carried away with the dialogue that's going on, and I'll find that instead of starting with the images at that point, I'll put the text first. So that probably means the panel 3 of my strip, there's often like a big blob of text along the top because I didn't really worry about where the images were going to go. And I was like, well, I'm going to start writing because I'm so excited about the next line. And so like I'll put that there. And then you know, and then panel 4, there's always the drama of like, how do I land this thing, you know, and you know, so maybe that gives you a little bit of an idea of kind of how that kind of plays out.
All right, I guess then for your second question, as far as building community in comics and cities, my work with Cake, I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I got into it volunteering just for the show, and later became involved with the organizers after it had really gained some momentum. And I mean, Neil was one of the co-founders of Cake itself, so having him move to Miami, I think, was a big boon for that city, as he's doing so much for it right now. So everyone in Miami is really lucky to have Neil. And building community, I think, is crucial. There are a ton of artists who just want to get their works out there. And personally, it's such a rush at the end of the show to see everyone kind of packing up and telling me like, oh, I had such a fantastic show, so good, thank you for doing that. To me, just puts me on like cloud, let alone 9, like 11, for like the rest of the week. It's so good. I don't know, how about you, Rob?
Well, I started going to SPX in 1997, and it was an outgrowth of an earlier tour from Jeff Smith, Dave Sim, and Linda Medley, I believe, called Spirits of Independence. And then it kind of, that spurred this like first show. And at that time, it really represented a group of cartoonists who were like, I refer to as the Xeric generation. They were getting Xeric grants and putting out mini comics. And there was this there had been this tremendous underground groundswell of mini comic swaps, short runs through places like Fact Sheet 5. And it started to like coalesce and start to form in person in shows like Ape in San Francisco, and then shortly thereafter SPX. And there's something about SPX, kind of like the central location, kind of the ease to get there, and also the organizational structure, and then above all else, the lottery table structure, where it's like anyone who did any kind of comic, no matter how good or bad or new or old, had a chance at getting a table. And it just, over the span of 25 years, becomes an institution where the culture, it creates a culture, but the culture shifts depending on who's there. And it's a show, above all else, that's about young cartoonists. They're the lifeblood of it. And so when the next wave comes along, that becomes kind of the new background, the new blueprint for the culture. And a show that started out, both in terms of attendees and artists, as primarily white and male, over the last 5, 10, 15 years, has become much more about artists of color, certainly about queer cartoonists. It's just this kind of transformational wave. There used to be, someone used to make a map of the SPX tables that say, here are all the queer artists. And it used to be this valuable service where it's like, oh, I know there's, these are people to seek out. And now it's just like, just the tables, practically. There's almost no point in doing it as much now. And this is reflective to me of the people who are becoming cartoonists now. There's this wave that is growing exponentially because of the last 20 years of the greater availability of the entire history of comics, length and breadth of comics. And this is a history that can be accessed in libraries, both in secondary, both in terms of like, high school, junior high school, elementary school, but also colleges and public libraries. Comics have become part of the regular landscape. And so as a result, there's this greater thirst for finding them, consuming them, and like finding like-minded people and finding people to like teach you how to do it. And that vibrancy and the vibrancy of youth is really gives hope for the future of comics in so many different ways. And I think with regard to community, communities are often built around like little publisher or around publishers. I think about a community growing around Fantagraphics in Seattle, and the comics scene in Montreal, and Stratton Quarterly's presence. And so I think of not just Neil, but also who's on this call, Jamila Rouser and her Black Josie Press, as like, these are very, very exciting events, because they tend to, publishers like this tend to like crop up, work together, and provide the opportunities for more community. And because again, it's an act of will, there's an intentionality to what Neil's doing and what Jamila's doing that I find really inspiring. And it's what fuels events like Cake, and it's what fuels events like SPX. They're not accidents. It's like there's real will. And even if like you're part of it or you start it or whatever, and you burn out, it's okay, because if you create something that people value so much in the community and they want to become part of it, and they do become part of it, they're there to take it on. With Neil with Cake and now Chris with Cake is a really good example. And I think the last thing I'll say, and I mentioned it in my essay, I feel like Miami is ripe to have a small press show. That Miami's kind of a hard place to get to. People don't understand just how long Florida is, and how, like, if you live even in the Southeast, it's like, oh, I'll drive to Miami. It's like, yeah, okay, you set aside 17 hours, 16 hours, and then there's that stretch down I-95, which is just grim. For a lot of that trip. But, that's a perfectly serviceable airport. But more to the point, Miami has one thing really in its advantage that these smaller cities don't, which is there's a lot of space. There's a lot of places to do things, to hold things. There's a ridiculous amount of hotel space. There's spaces built in Miami that are just underoccupied all the time and are just like begging to have events. And I just picture that a show in Miami would be like in December, because there are no real shows held in that month. Something either pre-Christmas or in early January after New Year's, again, which is a dead time in the alternative comics world as far as shows go, because of most of the places that have these shows, it's winter, can't really have them. In Miami, it'll be 70 degrees, and I can see events starting there and taking root, because there will be a lot to offer, in the shows and with the people there, and to kind of create its own orbit as a potential place to have this. communities build shows and shows build communities in equal turn. And I think Miami would benefit from that.
Cool. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Andrew, for your questions. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for such a really great conversation. And also thank you for such well-crafted stories and writings that you contributed to this issue of Spiny Orb Weaver. I'm pasting the links of our guests in the chat, along with links to Spiny Orb Weaver, to Radiator Comics Studio, and to the Ellies, which for Miami-Dade residents is accepting submissions for the 2021 Ellies Awards starting April 21st. We do have a few more announcements in April that I wanted to announce real quick before we go. So on Sunday, April 18th at 5 p.m. Eastern, we're hosting our semi-monthly social event, Cartoonist Coffee. If you make comics, please join us for casual small group conversations with other cartoonists. And then on Saturday, April 24th at 3 p.m. Eastern, another cake organizer, Sage Coffee, will present More Than Breaking Even. They'll talk about convention etiquette and how to price your mini comics without going broke. On Tuesday, April 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern, I'm moderating a conversation between Layla Abdel-Razak, Zach Clemente, Lawrence Lindell, and Carter Monier about their visions for the future of the small press comics community. And then every Friday, we host Open Studio. That's from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. It's a quiet time for you to work on your comics in the telepresence of others. And as mentioned during the presentation, Sun and Sand Comics Anthology is an anthology that Radiator Comics co-published with Black Jose Press. It features 10 wonderful comics about South Florida by South Florida cartoonists, including Drew Lerman and Jamila Rouser. If you go to sunsandcomics.wordpress.com, you can read them for free online. Download it as a PDF, or you can request a physical copy. And if you cover the shipping and handling, we will mail a copy to you. So information and links to register for all these events can be found at radiatorcomics.com/studio. Thanks everybody for hanging out with us, spending this time with us. And thanks again to Drew Lerman, Chris López, and Rob Clough, also to Oolite Arts and the Knight Foundation, and to all of you for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Happy reading. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.